Hello, I'm Philip Rawlings, the Roygood Professor of Commercial Law at the Centre for Commercial Law Studies, Queen Mary University of London. I'm also convener for International and Comparative Bank Regulation on the International Programme of the University of London. The regulation of banks used to be an important but rather obscure area of law. All of that changed in 2008 with the global financial crisis. Suddenly attention was drawn to the way banks were regulated, and the regulations and the regulators were criticised. How fair was this criticism? To answer this question, we need to understand what bank regulation is and what it seeks to achieve. To start, we need to understand something about banks. Why are banks more intensively regulated than other types of business? All businesses face risks, but they're not regulated in the detailed way that banks are. Why and how is a bank different from, say, a car maker or my local cafe? After all, the car maker and the cafe create products that could kill me. My bank might only lose my money, which is not great, but at least I'm still alive. Once we've discussed why banks are thought to need more regulation than other industries, we can look at the nature of that regulation and its objectives. Should the aim of regulation be to prevent any bank from failing? As a customer with their money in the bank, I might want this, but how does it fit in with ideas about free markets in which companies may fail if they are inefficient? And who should support the banks? Presumably this would be the state, which means taxpayers. This happened during the financial crisis, so we need to think about the implications. Another point is that if no bank is ever going to be allowed to fail, might this encourage banks to engage in risky investments? And if we don't want to prevent individual banks from collapsing, what's the aim of our regulatory system? Having thought about these fundamental issues, we can then move on to another problem, and that is the international nature of banking. Banking is connected around the world, but regulators are confined by national borders. This suggests that we need some globally agreed standards, but how are these to be achieved? We'll look at the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, which is in Switzerland, and attempts to establish such standards. What is this body, and what are the challenges it faces? How easy is it to establish regulations suitable for all types of banks, the big international bank with offices around the world and the small regional bank? How are such regulations to be enforced when enforcement depends on each country's regulator and the resources available to some regulators are very limited because they're in relatively poor countries? One solution to some of these problems might be to have regulators operating across national borders. So we look at the European Union as an interesting illustration of how an economic union of countries may be able to tackle some of these issues. But the EU has faced its own problems. How do you get all the member states to agree? Should a single set of rules apply to all states? And should there be a single EU regulator? Finally, the course looks at the UK because it provides an interesting case study. In 1979, there was no UK legislation on bank regulation. So we discuss why the UK introduced regulation and what it was meant to achieve. We can then look at how regulation has changed and think about why it's changed. One lesson from this case study is that there is a tendency to look backwards and regulate for the last crisis, even though history tells us that the next crisis is likely to have different causes and effects. I should say at this point that although the course discusses the European Union and the UK, this is merely to illustrate issues. We also look at regulation in different countries, and students are encouraged to research the way in which their own jurisdictions have dealt with the challenges posed by banks. The aim of this course is to provide you with the basic tools to enable you to understand this interesting and exciting area of law. It's not meant to turn out expert regulators. You don't need to be a mathematician or have knowledge of any particular area of law. But it's worth saying that regulation is proving an attractive field for employment growth as financial institutions desperately seek to hire people to cope with the massive regulations. So, as well as being an interesting subject in its own right, and something that tells us a lot about banking and the law, the study of banking regulation might prove a useful career route.